Madam Chair, members of the committee, good evening. Here to present AJR 27. It's a resolution that has to deals with specifically a free trade agreement negotiated between the United States President and Colombia. And generally, it deals with the ongoing issue of trade agreements between the United States and other countries and the resulting, in most instances, if not all, loss of American jobs. This particular agreement is more troubling because of the record in Colombia. The government-sanctioned assassination of unionists, union leaders, particularly in the teaching profession. 48 unionists in 2009 were murdered. Over 500 unionists were murdered under the administration of the previous president. So it seems to me that rather than ratify an agreement with a country that is killing union members, union leaders, those that are trying to organize and raise the standard of living, we should speak out here in California. And the purpose of this resolution is to ask the United States Congress not to ratify the trade agreement negotiated between the United States and Colombia. I do have 3 witnesses in support of the measure that are ready to testify at your convenience, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Witnesses in support.
Madam Chair, my name is Bill Camp. I'm the Executive Secretary of the Sacramento Central Labor Council. I and a number of leaders from the labor movement in California and around the nation traveled to Colombia 2 years ago. In fact, we met one of the leaders that were later assassinated. It's hard. It's very personal. We went to an area where an American company, Drummond Coal, was mining. The leader of that coal miners union, which they had a collective bargaining agreement, expressed to the company management concerns about the fact that workers were working 27 straight days without a break, getting only a couple $100 a month, working at 95-degree temperatures. The company management said there'll be blood in the streets before this ever changes, and that evening at 5 o'clock, the bus that the coal miners were traveling to go home was stopped in the country road. The president of the union was drug out of the bus by armed gunmen, murdered in front of 32 union members, and told to leave the body right there to make sure everybody knew that he was murdered. They took the bus 2 miles down the road. We went to this place, murdered the vice president of the union. 6 months later, murdered the replacement. So this is an American company in which is murdering the leaders who weren't even complaining about their own members, just concerned about the inhumane conditions of other workers. The fact that one of the workers that was, or leader that was organizing workers, was murdered after we had visited. But this still happens today. This year, in 2010 alone, 32 union leaders have been murdered already, not counting the 48 murdered last year. Totally, 2,754 union leaders have been murdered in the last 20 years. They had an amnesty program. 1/3 of the National Congress have been implicated in these murders. 1/3 of the elected members of the National Congress have been implicated in these murders. Only 4% of these people who carried out these executions have ever been prosecuted. And of those who were found guilty, 40% are still running free. They were never tried. They never showed up for the trial. They had a trial in absentia. So the labor movement is being murdered. And part of the problem is that it's the wrong message for us to say we'll open up our arms to trade with people who murder so many, so consistently, and refuse to investigate. We met with the American ambassador's chief staff, talked about this problem, met with the leaders of the government. I met with them the next time I went down. And while I was meeting with the vice president in charge of human rights violations, they were planning the execution of the union leader I'd met the year before. Somebody was. I don't know who it was. So we're asking that we help send a message that says this nation was not built on murdering union leaders. Yes.
Okay, call the roll.
Gray McLeod.
Here.
Wyland. Onestad. Alban. Corbett. Correa. Flores.
Here.
Walters. Yee.
We have a quorum. I'm sorry for interrupting you.
No interruption. I think it's important about where we stand in the nation and the world, and we ask you to vote aye for this resolution.
Thank you very much. Others?
Good evening, Madam Chair. My name is George Landers. I am the Executive Director of the Western States Council of United Food and Commercial Workers Union. I was also on that trip with Bill Camp as well as Art Pulaski and several other folks from around the country when we went down to Colombia. And one of the things that I found really as a very eerie juxtaposition there was when you go into the union halls down there. In the union halls up here, you walk in the front, and usually in the lobby you have like plaques for United Fund or maybe sporting event trophies or this accolade or that other accolade. Down there, they have pictures of deceased members and leaders who have been murdered. And it's not just one or two. It's a matter of there will be several. Most of them are hand-drawn with the names. And it's not unusual for the leadership and even for the membership to be telling you to sit down with you and tell you who those people were, tell you about their lives, tell you about their family, because they were their neighbors. They were people who they had grown up with. It was very interesting when we were there, and also in that I was watching the TV and watching the local news, and there was very big news that when we were there, we were in Bogota at the time, and they had the successful extradition of an assassin from Brazil, who they were finally able to get back. And during the entire time while they were talking about this story, one of the interesting things about Latino channels, both here and down there, is that they don't have the filters like we do on the regular three major channels. So they show everything. What they kept repeating was the assassination of the union leader outside his home as he was going home in the city, and had been caught on a security camera. And so for a 2-day period, I got to see this just repeating over and over. As Bill said, we had meetings with the business groups. We had meetings at the embassy. And during the meeting at the embassy, we spoke with the political officer of the embassy as well as one of the USAID officials. And during our conversation, I had stated to him, I said, this is something that's unacceptable. And I said, well, last year you had 72 trade unionists killed. And he said, no, that wasn't last year. That was the year before. Last year we only had 39. Only 39. They thought that was an improvement. This is not a message that we can continue to send and say that it's all right. Whenever one of the unions, the union sector has gone from about 15% of the workforce down to about 5% through a combination of the chilling effect of the assassinations as well as a revision of labor law in the country. And whenever there's an organizing drive, the worst phrase that the union leaders can hear is someone in the government say, well, that union's been infiltrated by the communists, because that's the signal. That's the signal to go out and start killing them. So we're asking, as a result of this, we're really asking that we're begging you, please support this amendment and the resolution, rather. And thank you for your help and time.
Madam Chair and members, Caitlin Vega for the California Labor Federation. We are sponsors of this resolution. Normally when we come in here and talk about trade agreements, we're talking about whether there are enforceable workers' rights in the country that we would be doing trade with. Here, not only are there clearly no enforceable workers' rights, there's not even the most basic ability for workers to try to get together and improve their own conditions. There's not even the basic ability for workers to say that they want to try to form a union, because literally they will risk their lives. And so the stakes are much, much higher here. And the country of Colombia has more unionists killed than the rest of the world all put together. It's a country where there is clearly a coordinated campaign to target unionists and no penalties for those who do. And so we are here urging that you take this very seriously. We've all met with families and those left behind. These are all members of their community. These are parents. We've met with their children who have had to take their own risks in speaking out about what's happened to their families. So we hope that you will take this opportunity to say to the country of Colombia, there's nothing wrong with trade agreements, there's nothing wrong with expanding trade, but there's a certain level of basic humanity that we expect from our trading partners, and we're not seeing it from the country of Colombia. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members of the committee, Jeremy Smith here on behalf of the State Building and Construction Trades Council, here in support of our brothers and sisters.
Thank you.
Shane Gussman on behalf of the Teamsters, the Machinists, Unite Here, the Amalgamated Transit Union, and others in support.
Thank you. Anybody else in support? Opposition?
Good evening, Chairwoman and members. Thomas Vu with the California Chamber of Commerce in opposition. The free trade agreement promotes economic growth and further enhances trade between the U.S. and Colombia. Colombia is an important trading partner of the U.S. and an important trading partner of California. In 2009, the U.S. exported over $9.5 billion worth of goods to Colombia, and California itself exported more than $320 million in goods to Colombia. Over the last decade, Colombia has made great strides in democracy and human rights. Recently, they had very successful presidential elections. And I think that's more than we can say for many of the countries down in South America. They have a strong commitment to democracy and transparency. And, of course, obviously things are not ideal in Colombia at this point, but we believe that with more trade and openness, that will help them reach that point. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else in opposition? Questions from the members? Mr. Whelan.
I have no doubt that this has occurred, and I think it's horrible and reprehensible, and I believe all over the world that workers ought to have the ability to organize, as exists in pretty much all of the Western world. But I'd like to point out a few things. Many, many years ago, I spent some time in Colombia. And as in many countries, there was a history of violence. In the 50s, there was something they call la violencia, the violence. 99.999% of Americans never heard of it. They killed 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 people. When I was there, which dates me, I was in places like Cali and Medellin, and they're actually safe, but then, of course, we got a milder version of what we see in Mexico with the drug cartels. And there were years of incredible, unspeakable violence, and it's like what we're seeing in Mexico today. And just a side note, in Mexico, government officials are starting to say what really is at risk here is the actual future of a state, of a nation. That's how threatening it is as that close. So, and during that period, just one illustration of how incredible it was, too. The Supreme Court building was attacked. I don't know if you know that. It was attacked. The Supreme Court building. Judges were killed. Anyone who ran for office, they were assassinated, right and left, just running for office. In addition to the drug cartels, you have revolutionaries. Colombia was one of the places where liberation theology began, way back when, and which I think is a good thing, actually, a very good thing. But a lot of that led to all sorts of violence. You read it, it was sort of the equivalent. In Peru, there was a lot of stuff about what they got Sendero Luminoso, the shining path. A lot of it was extremely radical. A lot of people got killed. So my only point is, this is not like America or even Europe, where you can walk into a foyer and see activities in the country. It doesn't exist in those countries. That's America, where that exists. That doesn't even exist in Europe, because community participation like that is almost unheard of. And the only thing I would like you perhaps to think about is, this is horrible, and it needs to be changed. But does this really do it, or are we better off? Is there a broader impact on poor people there? You talked about how much those coal miners were earning. It was horrible, and I must say, I absolutely believe this happened, but I do not believe that an American company assassinated people. But I do believe it happened from all the various reasons. My thought is their workers are net better off. If we look, and I'll just end with this. If we look at the rest of the world, because this is something that really ticks me off, look at the trade we're doing with China. Workers have zero rights, and this is something I think I'd love to do a resolution on this. 25% of our particulate air pollution comes from China. They have no pollution controls, no worker rights, nothing for the environment, and we send our jobs. And I think this is one of the things that the labor movement ought to be extremely proud of. I'm proud of it for all of us. We've taken in this country and given working class folks a middle class life, and we have sold them for 20 or 30 years down the river. And the big dollars are happening in China, where there's no opportunity to do any of this. So I guess I'd say I really appreciate, I understand the thought. It is horrible, and it ought to be fixed. I just think, given that example, the people would be better off, and we'd be better off to try to stop this in a different way.
I appreciate your comment, Senator. A couple of observations. First, difference of opinion, of course. What I'm saying with this resolution, I think the supporters are saying as well, is our free trade agreements with Colombia, with other countries, with China, have to be different. We are currently engaged in a race to the bottom, where the standard of living is not being raised in other countries, it's being lowered. And in the United States, we are all Democrats and Republicans, proud of the fact that this country has, or used to have, a growing middle class. We're losing that. So some of us believe, and I believe, that taking a stance on this, look, I'm not here to tell you that when the Congress is waiting for this resolution to arrive. I know they're not. But I think it is an opportunity for us to start to have a dialogue about these fair trade agreements, so-called fair trade agreements, and to try to establish some international standard of human rights, of environmental protection. We're losing that battle. We try to do things here in California as if we were in a vacuum, and we're not. And all of the pollution you're talking about in China, we are left to deal with. So this resolution deals with the middle class question, I think, and it starts to have that dialogue first. Second, you mentioned several conflicts, historic conflicts, ongoing conflicts, Peru, Colombia, IAD, Nicaragua. I think the fundamental difference between those situations and the situation today in Colombia is this. Those murders were a product of political conflict, and the murders were done between and among opposite sides of a political battle to run the country, outside of the governmental influence or by the government against the political opposition. This situation is not only sanctioned by the government, people have not been brought to trial, there has been no justice, and it is targeted to the very people whose job they have chosen, whose careers they have chosen to raise the standard of living. I mean trade unionists and union leaders. So there is a difference in what's happening in Colombia in terms of the rationale, in terms of the support, in terms of the protection that they get, in terms of the sanctioning by paramilitary groups, by people in very high positions in the government of Colombia. So I think it's appropriate for us here in California to take a stance and to start saying, if there's going to be a trade agreement with the United States of America, then it's going to be a fair trade agreement, and we're going to protect American jobs, and we're going to raise the standard of living. If people are going to be murdered in Colombia for trying to raise the standard of living through unionization, I can't very well see that trade agreement is going to raise standard of living in the country. So with that, I would respectfully ask for an aye vote from the committee.
Close.
Yes, okay. Madam Chair.
Did you have a...
Just very brief.
Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just wanted to say that I concur with some of the comments made by Mr. Weiland. I would really love to see these trade agreements that would really address adequately collective bargaining, immigration, which nobody ever talks about, part of these agreements, environmental issues as well. So I think we're talking apples and apples here, but I think we're missing the whole, the central crux of a lot of these issues.
Okay, do I have a motion to... Bill has been moved. Call for the vote.
McGrady McLeod?
Aye.
McGrady McLeod, aye. Wyland?
No.
Wyland, no. Onestad? Calderon? Corbett? Aye. Corbett, aye. Correa? Flores? Flores, aye. Walters? Yee?
Aye.
Yee, aye.
Correa, aye.
Correa, aye.
Senators, thank you very much, Madam Chair. Senator Correa, appreciate it.
Thank you for waiting. 5-1. Bill is out. Okay. You're welcome. Mr. Nielo? Mr. Nielo has item 1, AB 1140.
Senator Onestad was here.
Oh, I didn't hear you. Okay. You were quiet. No. No, that's 5-2. Senator Onestad was a no. Would you care to present?
Senator Onestad has voted no on my bill already.
No.
Madam Chair and members, thank you very much for accommodating us on this unexpectedly late hour, but I have a feeling I'm going to be around here a while longer anyway. The old bugaboo of unintended consequences is what brings me here to present AB 1140. This legislation will grant flight schools, flight instructors, and aircraft maintenance programs an extension on the implementation of legislation that I jointly authored last year to reestablish the Bureau of Private Post-Secondary Education. That was AB 48. In drafting that bill, we unfortunately failed to provide an exemption from the Bureau to flight instructors or institutions that offer Federal Aviation Administration certified education programs. We had an MOU with the FAA that these institutions and instructors were therefore not regulated by the Bureau, but by the FAA. The FAA supervision was deemed sufficient. The reestablishment of the Bureau and the subsequent development of regulations without this exemption has caught this industry understandably off guard. The flight industry is unique. The vast majority of aircraft instruction is done by certified flight instructors who act on an independent basis, and they accept payment for their services on a per-lesson basis. This is important because it means that in those circumstances, they're not collecting money up front. The money is only paid after the service is rendered. These small operators, of which there are many in California, have said that the provisions of AB 48 could have a very detrimental effect on their business and could actually force them to close and move out of state. The type of service that they provide and their size makes the cost of the regulation burdensome. While I won't get into all of the specifics of the industry at this time, I believe it is wholly appropriate that the legislature approve AB 1140 on an urgency basis. We do need it to be urgency because AB 48 became effective the beginning of this month to provide these institutions with a regulatory reprieve in order to provide the legislature then to carefully review the nature of this particular industry and whether or not the provisions of AB 48 should be applicable, which they were not under the prior regulatory scheme. Two additional points. I know that the committee has already approved legislation to address this issue in Mr. Portantino's AB 1889. However, and I have discussed this with Mr. Portantino, there are provisions of that bill that are highly problematic, and the administration, and it's been suggested, highly problematic for the administration, and it's been suggested to me and my staff that there is a real threat of a veto of AB 889. Not at all for reasons due to the proposal in my bill. We should not and cannot let the politics of that particular bill get in the way of addressing this problem discreetly. Now, finally, your committee has also recommended amendments that would cut short the extension to July 1st of 2011. We had proposed that it be until the end of next year. I have to stress the practicality of the longer time frame. The shorter date would require that we have hearings and come to a policy approach, a relevant and appropriate policy approach, and do it again with urgency legislation by July 1 of next year. I would suggest that because of everything else that is going on, that it is very unlikely that we would even have our first hearings to discuss the issue until after the 1st of next year, until after December of 2010. And that leaves very little time, and again, it would have to be urgency legislation. Allowing the full year and therefore not the need of urgency legislation to give very careful consideration to this issue that has a very significant effect on the livelihood of hundreds, maybe even thousands of these instructors for a reason that really arguably would not be relevant in the first place, would be a real tragedy. I have to testify with me today Laura Brown, representing the National Air Transportation Association, and John Pfeiffer with the Airplane Owners and Pilots Association, and I ask for your aye vote.
Okay. Before we move the bill, my rationale for the 1 year is that this legislature, the governor, and everyone associated with the legislature has been zinged numerous times by various newspaper articles that we do not take our job seriously in regulating all of the boards and all of the commissions and everything else. And I think to extend it to 18 months would give that impression that we are, in fact, just kind of diddling around and not doing anything. And so I would prefer, and I'm going to ask, as the amendment said, that we're going to go to the 1 year, and everybody's going to have to hightail their little fannies and work hard and do the hearings much sooner than you have, and try to do this because we really need to protect the consumers, and we really need to be looked at as a do-nothing legislature, because there have been numerous articles, numerous stories that have hit these things, and there's circumstances why, while it's not our fault, we can't keep saying it's not our fault. We're going to have to take it seriously, and so I'm going to insist that you take the 1 year.
I understand your reasoning, and I do appreciate it, and certainly for the sake of the individuals that are affected and their livelihood, I want the bill to get out, and I want to avoid it being caught up in the political controversy of Mr. Portantino's bill, but I'd just suggest that by allowing until the end of next year does indeed prove that we're being serious about this, because we're not going to rush a determination of this issue in the interest of making sure that the regulation is appropriate, because some flight schools could be different than other flight schools. And as I said, I think the legislature needs the time to consider that. And then in order to arrive at a solution and implement whatever the deliberative hearings would suggest, we would be doing that in a seeming rush, which also could be viewed critically, particularly if for some reasons it became controversial that made it difficult, would make it very easy to get a simple majority, but very difficult to get a supermajority for the urgency. Then if there is good legitimate reason to do something different than AB 48 is now, we run the risk for that difference in the threshold of literally destroying the livelihoods of a lot of single operators that give flight instruction.
I think we already are aware of all the problems. I think, the legislature and everybody has noticed that there was a bill and it left out certain people, the flight instructors, and now we're doing it. So I think it behooves everybody to come to some agreement quickly, and I don't think that's really rushing it. I think they've got till next July.
No, I understand that. It's not just the rushing, it's also the requirement of the urgency in order to implement anything next year.
I'm sure your charm will carry us through, and you will be able to get that 2/3.
Madam Chair, I may or may not be here.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know.
I have confidence, but no guarantees. Well, let's hear from the witnesses and then see what questions or concerns the committee has, and I can answer other questions also.
Madam Chair and members, Laura Brown on behalf of the National Air Transportation Association. We are in support. We are the sponsors of the bill, and we appreciate the committee staff's hard work and analysis on these important issues. We do believe that this is an appropriate policy measure just to delay the implementation while we thoroughly vet the issues, the complex and unique issues around the flight community, and we look forward to working with the legislature next year to accomplish this goal.
Thank you.
And with me, I have Jim Brannon, too, who is a pilot in Fresno County.
Oh.
Good afternoon. Good evening.
Yeah, good evening.
Did
Madam
you bring
Chair.
some s'mores? Because I said we were going to do it.
No, I wished I had a. Well, thank you, Madam Chair and committee. My name is Jim Brannon, and I've operated and owned a flight school, pardon me, in Fresno, California for 33 years. I've been flight instructing in California for 41 years. I spent my entire life involved in aviation. It's an incredible industry. We do a lot to not just promote aviation, but to train pilots that fly the airliners that you all fly all the time. It's a vital industry to California. I have 26 employees that work for me that depend on me for just everything under the sun, really, really good, faithful employees. And I can tell you that 1140 is vital if we're going to be able to save our industry. I've talked with schools throughout the state, FAA-approved Part 61 schools and individual flight instructors, and it's pretty unanimous that we're not going to be able to survive under AB 48 if we don't get some relief. So the 1140 has given us an opportunity to really pursue a workable solution, and I'm here wholeheartedly to support that.
Well, as I said, we wholeheartedly agree with the bill. The only problem we have is the implementation of the 18 months as opposed to the 12. So that's the only thing. I mean, we understand the problem, and we're trying to move it forward with the exception of that. Okay, so.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, members. I'm Mark Santacroce. I'm one of the independent flight instructors. I have suspended my business as of the 1st of August so as not to be in violation of California law. I feel as if I can sustain my business and my students can wait through the end of August to hopefully get resolution on AB 1140. Beyond that, I'm going to be in the dire straits that the others have mentioned. So I ask for your support and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Anybody else in support of the bill?
By the way, Madam Chair, I mentioned John Pfeiffer, but I'm mistaken. I don't believe that he's here.
No, I know John.
I'm not as good looking as John, but Joanne Betancourt, representing the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. This extension is crucial to our members, and we urge I vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else in support? Opposition?
I'm Helen Roth Dowden with SEIU Local 1000. And this same provision is in 1889 by Portantino. And, the chair spoke to the fact of the public wanting to see that consumers were respected. 1889 is a balance. It makes some changes in the original law that were needed because of unintended consequences. Some of those affect our members who work as education specialists. Others affect consumers. And so 1889 has the exact same provision as the NILO bill. And we would ask that by allowing the governor to veto all the consumer changes that were made in 1889, but to accept something that helped the schools, that really isn't the balance that we would like to see. So we would ask that you would double join this to 1889 so both of these things could be enacted. You could have the consumer problems met, and you could have also the problem of the flight schools. We're not opposing the flight schools, but we think it's only half a loaf where it helps some people. You're leaving out a whole bunch of other people where there were unintended consequences. We've met with the Department of Consumer Affairs with Brian Stivers on our issue. We have another meeting. We're trying to work something out with the administration because what has been done is to allow the department to move people who are education specialists, not just out of Sacramento, which we're not opposed to them being other places, but to actually change what their jobs are and have them not being approving schools and seeing a school all the way through the approval process, but only getting the forms after it's basically the analysts have approved it here, going out and visiting the schools. That's not what education specialists do in the Department of Veterans Affairs, in CDE, Department of Education. We're really making a big change here, and that's what we want to try and prevent. We're not asking for the people who had those jobs in the old bureau to have their jobs back. That's not what it's about. It's about making sure that consumers who are these students actually are going to schools where they get jobs, where they actually can gain a livelihood out of their education. And for that reason, we would ask you to double join these two bills so both the consumers and the flight schools in the end win on this.
Thank you. Questions for the members?
Is that opposition?
Yeah.
Yes, we have a letter. We've met with your staff on the opposition to it. And what our point though is, if you double join these bills, then both of the things you have the flight schools, and you also have this. The same language that's in this bill is in 1889, though. So by just having 18, which was passed by this committee already, you solve the problem.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. To Mr. Nilo, this is really putting all of us in a quandary where, on the one hand, it's been suggested that the bill that passed out of this committee, which was in fact, I think as the opposition indicated, and I think all of us agree, was a rather balanced approach to try and deal with a, sort of an oversight, that because there's been some suggestion that the earlier bill would in fact be vetoed, then if we did in fact offer this particular bill, then doesn't it sort of make that suggestion or suspicion even more of a reality then? Mm-hmm. That this takes half of the loaf and
maybe the governor is more prepared to deal with half a loaf than the whole loaf, and you're offering him exactly that. We will be enabling you to also offer that, and we would be all in cahoots to try and undermine something that we just passed earlier. I think that's the quandary that I sort of feel that we're being presented right now.
Well, I think you can tell by the testimony in opposition that the interest is in another issue, which is a completely separate debate. It still has to do with AB 48, but it is a completely separate debate. If it is completely separate and not at all related, I don't see the logic of necessarily joining the two. I don't see any sort of balanced approach in that. What I see is two separate debates for completely separate reasons being forced into the same bill, and I would suggest perhaps for political reasons. And I say that bold statement because one has to believe that the Portantino bill really isn't serious about the flight instructor issue because it's not even an urgency. It wouldn't have any effect until January 1st, and in the meantime, these guys they see the legislative intent that appears to be brewing, but they're out of business because if the Bureau chooses to put them under the regulatory structure, they have problems. So I would suggest that perhaps the Portantino bill is not really serious about the flight school issue. And again, it is a separate debate for completely separate reasons, and I just can't see any logic in combining them. You can let the Portantino vehicle go ahead, but my bill, with the urgency, would address the issue in a satisfactory way with concerns about the time frame, obviously, but nonetheless, it just seems to be a much better approach in the interest of solving the apparent problem that we have.
Yes.
I'm sorry. No, that's fine.
You're all done?
Yeah.
No. Okay.
Would the author and the sponsors be okay with accepting the chair's notion of a 12-month?
As I said, it's very important that this bill move forward on an urgency basis, and while I would prefer the longer time frame for the reasons I stated, it's important that we move forward on the policy introduced in the bill. So yes, I would accept that.
Well, the reason I propose this is, let's be honest with ourselves. We all understand political leverage, and I have no, we're in politics, and I understand completely why, and unfortunately I wasn't here to hear the Portantino bill, but it may be a very good bill, and I can understand completely why there would be a desire to encourage the governor to sign it. I understand that completely. But to take innocent victims who literally could be put out of business, that part I don't understand. I'm willing to buy that the Portantino bill may be fair and balanced and all those things. I certainly can understand why SEIU is concerned about implications for its membership. I understand all of that. But the testimony here has been about the Portantino bill. And, my thought is if you want to use leverage, don't put someone out of business and lose those jobs and lose that income in order to do it. And I would propose that instead, if you would accept it, I don't know if the amendment would be taken by the committee, but if the chair is interested, I would propose an amendment to the bill or suggest that whatever is appropriate, that the author amend the bill to 12 months, and maybe we have a chance of getting it out on that basis.
As I have stated, it is extremely important that we move forward on the stay for this group so that we can consider the effects on them and consider what's appropriate. I agree with the chair. We can get it done if we have to. I'm a bit concerned about the urgency threshold next year. But this bill is too important to not accept that amendment to move it forward.
Mr. Armistead. Who else? Mr. Armistead and then Mr. Hughes.
Well, with that, since the chair has said that her only reservation was the 12-month period, and you've agreed to take the amendment. Madam Chair, I'd like to move the bill as amended with the language that your committee has proposed.
Okay. And I won't take the motion till we finish hearing.
I just want to comment. You know, I think the author and I think Senator Weiland talked about leverage and sort of politics and so on, but that's the business that we're in. And any way and every way that we can somehow leverage something, we will try to do that. So I don't fault Senator or Assemblymember Portantino for doing whatever he needs to do in terms of trying to look at an array of issues and finding a way to at least address as many of those problems as he can. And so you know, I just think that we ought not to judge, you know, about how we leverage whatever. I mean, just on the floor of the Senate, you know, we leverage some other things about a water bond. So, you know, then that may not be about jobs, but that's like a lot of money that's going to affect a lot of other individuals. You know, my problem, and where I'm stuck with right now, is the fact that we passed a bill that I felt was rather balanced. With this particular bill, regardless of whether or not you're going to do 1 year, year and a half, you jeopardize that particular bill. And so that's my difficulty. While you argue that, well, gee, you know, if you're really, you know, interested in saving these jobs in this particular industry, you ought to make it as clean as possible. But on the other side, you know, if other powers to be are very interested in saving those jobs, then you might want to reconsider your opposition to a bill that may have some other things that you may not like. But there are greater good in that particular bill, which is, as you indicate, Assemblymember Neal, saving industry, saving some jobs, and livelihoods of individuals. So I think at the end of the day, you've got to somehow balance everything off. You know, nothing is ever nicely packaged, and the Portantino has something for everyone. It seems to me that that's a more balanced approach, a more comprehensive approach dealing with a variety of needs here in the state of California. So with that, you know, well,
before you respond,
just Madam Chair, you know, if it is to just address his issue only, I'm going to be a no vote on the bill.
Okay. Mr. Portantino is not against this bill, and Mr. Portantino has not asked for co-joining of this bill, just so everybody understands. Okay, Ms. Corbett.
Could I make a comment about Mr. Yee's comments?
Put it in his bill.
I don't think you heard me spend a lot of words lamenting the political reality of this. That wasn't my point. Nor have I said anything either for or against Mr. Portantino's bill. The simple fact of the matter is, though, that the administration has indicated that they will veto Mr. Portantino's bill. I believe that they mean that, and they will. So, therefore, if that's the case, you're killing the opportunity for this particular solution that I have in this bill. And with regard to a bill having something for everyone, you know, an approach could attempt to be so broad that maybe it's got something for everyone, and then in the final analysis, to quote a great friend of mine, it has nothing for anybody. But the final thing I'd say was I have to wonder about the seriousness that Mr. Portantino's approach views this particular problem that's addressed in my bill when it doesn't even have an urgency. And that's essential. Without an urgency, it's not addressing the problem. So,
can I just say something? There is language in the Portantino bill that joins it with this. It's already in 1889. There's language in his bill that joins it.
Well, Mr. Portantino has not talked to me, has not said I need to join this bill, nor has he talked to me about being against this bill. So until he comes and talks to me, I am to assume that he has no problems with the bill, nor does he wish it to be co-joined. Go ahead, Mr.
Yeah, we obviously don't want to spend our time doing this, but just in response to what Senator Yee was saying, I understand completely the business we're in, and I have no problem with leveraging things. I understand we do this all the time, and I have no problem with SEIU's interest in the Portantino bill. I have no problem with any of that. But what my point was, I think in this instance, in this just particular instance, we're choosing leverage that literally can just destroy something. So, you're talking about a lot of airplanes, a lot of businesses, a lot of people who want to learn how to fly, and a lot of income to the state. And it just seems to me an unfortunate, if you want that, I'd almost rather help you find some other kind of leverage, is all I'm saying. So I'm just in line with what the chair is saying. I hope we can figure out a way to move the bill forward, and then if you still want to do that, figure out some other way to do it.
Okay, the bill has been moved by Senator Onestad, so we'll call for the vote.
Amended or anything?
Amended to the 1 year.
And I agree to that.
McGrady-McLeod?
Aye.
McGrady-McLeod, aye. Wyland? Aye. Wyland, aye. Onestad? Aye. Onestad, aye. Calderon? Corbett? Aye. Corbett, aye. Correa?
Aye.
Correa, aye. Flores? Flores, aye. Walters? Yee?
No.
Yee, no. 6-1.
6-1, that bill is up.
It's out. Thank you very much. Appreciate the time.
I understand. Mr. Jones, I saw Mr. Jones. Yes, he's here. You joined us this evening at our midnight meeting.
Pleasure to be here at your midnight meeting.
At our soiree here in the evening.
Your soiree.
Yes.
I thought I might not make it, but I have.
Okay. AB 1542, which is item 2.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Senators, this bill seeks to establish some standards for a medical home. A medical home is not a physical place per se. It's a concept. It's a approach to providing coordinated care in a way that's patient-centered, that seeks to make sure that care is coordinated and that there's collaboration between and amongst various providers. It still is a concept that encompasses physician-directed care. And the standards that we're setting forth in this bill in no way impinge upon the various licensing requirements and licensing boards that exist for various categories of care providers. And to the extent that there are licensing issues or issues related to the conduct of individuals who are licensed under different licensing regimes, this in no way impinges on that. What this does do is set basically a floor for the provision of a concept of coordinated care that is increasingly of great interest nationwide. And we're seeing a lot of activity in this area in other states. We're also seeing in the national health care reform legislation a real push to move in this direction. So this lets us establish essentially some basic standards for this medical home approach. With that, we have the sponsor of the bill, the California Academy of Family Physicians, and some other witnesses who'd like to speak on behalf of the bill. We're very happy to take, as authors, amendments. The amendments called out in the committee analysis, and we appreciate the chair and the committee staff working so closely with my office and the sponsor and me on the content of the bill.
Thank you. Witnesses in support, please.
Madam Chair, Tom Riley with the sponsors, the California Academy of Family Physicians, as well as the Osteopathic Physicians and Surgeons of California. I know the hour is late. I will be very brief. The reason this bill is important is that family doctors and other doctors, as well as other healthcare providers, are realizing that we can do a better job by working as teams together, by employing electronic health records, by doing a variety of things that turns out leaves the patient healthier, makes healthcare services more available to them, has the sum of the providers be greater than their numbers, and allows for the healthcare delivery system to work the way it ought to. We urge you to support this bill. It's been done in a number of other states. The family physicians embrace it, as well as others. We know of no opposition.
Thank you.
Good evening, Madam Chair and members. Christy Weiss on behalf of the California Association of Nurse Practitioners. We are in support of the bill and would like to thank Mr. Jones for his willingness to work with us. We believe that with the full implementation of healthcare reform, nurse practitioners have an important role to play in making sure that as many Californians as possible have access to healthcare, and we believe this bill will help us further that goal. Thank you.
As the sponsors of the bill, the only thing that concerns me is that the nomenclature of home is confusing to many people, as it was to this legislator and when we first started to take care of this in the health committee. You know, because everybody thinks of a home as an actual mortars and bricks and everything else rather than just a concept of an idea. I wish they would have chosen another
I wish
name.
they would have too, and that's why I started by saying it's not a place; it's more a concept. Because you're right, it is a problem, but it is the term of art that's being used nationwide. And
I would ask if it's just a concept, and how would it affect a single-family residence? Maybe a couple of elderly folks living in that residence.
Well, it's not about a physical structure. It's about.
I know it's not, but how would it affect that situation?
It wouldn't. It wouldn't.
Why?
I mean, first of all, there's nothing mandatory in the bill. But the bill is essentially saying, look, if a provider is holding themselves out as providing a medical home, then these are the sorts of things that they have to provide. Essentially, it's sort of a truth in advertising in a way. I mean, this is a concept and an approach that's gaining currency. We want to encourage it, but it doesn't mandate it. But in the event that there were individual physicians that were attending those individuals, and maybe one of them is in a managed health care plan, maybe one is in a PPO, if their physicians elected to participate in the medical home approach, then that physician would need to adhere to the standards set herein. I'll defer to Mr. Riley if he wants to add anything more.
Well, also in response to this, as well as Madam Chair's concerns, which you have expressed on a number of occasions,
yes.
We have expanded on a portion of the bill, which is on page 3, line 9, which talks about other, perhaps better terms than the medical home term. We don't know which of those will take off, but right now there's multiple terms being used for the same thing, and we've enumerated on those.
Dr. Onestead and I heard this in health. Okay, no questions? Do I have anybody moving the bill? Okay, yeah.
And yet, I mean, you just, Mr. Riley, just gave us the fact that whole term is evolving, is nebulous, and yet we're now going to put it into law. That's what this bill does, and it's going to define it. Even though it's an evolving term or concept nationwide, not just in California. And that means that the term home is going to look different in California than it will be in Utah or Colorado. And we know that the federal legislation just recently enacted is also trying to define this term. And I think it's really premature for California to sit here and try to define this very nebulous, brand new, evolving term with the limited input that we have right now, when even the federal model has not defined it. And I'm just wondering what is the hurry for this bill? Why can't this bill wait until we get some more input from the federal model?
Excellent point. I think the hurry is that right now physicians and others throughout this state are trying to figure out what ought we be doing to build for to use the Wayne Gretzky analysis, that where the hockey puck's going, not where it's been. And that involves changing the way their practices operate. And in PPACA, they have defined it using a different set of terms. In 23 states, they've actually used the term patient-centered medical home. But we're all talking about the same thing that was developed in collaboration between several national organizations looking at outcomes, looking at models. Originally in this legislation, we had the NCQA certification, which I've been told has more than 100 applicants per week nationwide saying we want to become a patient-centered medical home. What we did in this bill, being concerned about exactly what you've raised, is we don't want to have so much specificity in something where a physician looking down the road trying to decide how ought their practices be built is constrained by too much detail. So what we did is to back off and to use much broader concepts that we see operating in actually more than those 23 other states that have adopted legislation similar to this. Broad concepts, more like compass directions than blueprints, more like an indication of these are the 7 or 8 general things you ought to be building towards, rather than specific things that say you will be in violation if you don't do X and so.
And yet you're putting this under the licensure provision of the code. I mean, the next step is to say you are in violation.
Well,
that's what the licensure provision does.
I want to clarify that. I mean, we are not impinging upon or adding to licensing qualifications of individual providers. We are saying if you hold yourself out as having one of these, then these are the general compass directions on what you ought to have. But this is not an element of or a licensing standard. We've been very careful to craft this in a way that we don't impinge upon the various existing statutory and regulatory licensing requirements. Around which I might add, there is some variety from state to state. I mean, I think that there is some benefit in as Tom pointed to a moment ago. I mean, initially we did look to a national standard, and we found it was too constraining. And frankly, we heard a lot of complaints from each of the major practice group associations in California about adhering to this national standard. So what we've crafted here, with the input of the various associations, is something that provides a floor, provides some general direction, but isn't so restrictive and constraining as to constrain the ability and the natural evolution of this sort of approach.
Anybody else? Is there any opposition? I forgot to ask for that. Seeing no opposition, do I have a...
So moved.
So moved. Your bill has been moved. Go ahead.
Negrete McLeod?
As amended.
Yes, as amended.
As amended. Aye.
Negrete McLeod, aye. Wyland? Onestad? Onestad, no. Calderon? Corbett? Aye. Corbett, aye. Correa? Aye. Correa, aye. Flores? Aye. Flores, aye. Walters? Yee? Aye. Yee, aye. 5-1.
Your bill is out.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Senators.
Thank you, Senators, for hanging around this late.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Where's the s'mores?
I don't know. We'll have